Welcome to Public Health Matters, where we talk about matters of public health. I'm Bobby Bagley, Chief Public Health Official and Director for the Division of Public Health and Community Services. And I'm here with Donna Plurd, who is the training coordinator for New Hampshire Free. I'm going to get the title wrong, Donna, so tell me what your title is again.
No, you're right. It's training coordinator for the New Hampshire Traffic-Free Coalition.
Traffic-Free Coalition. Mm-hmm. And so, Donna, tell us a little bit about what exactly that is. What is it that you actually do?
Right now, as training coordinator, we work together in a collaborative effort of organizations across the state coming together to provide education and training for, that could be for professionals such as healthcare professionals, service providers, educators, law enforcement, but also for communities, churches, and other faith groups, and interested citizens to provide an opportunity for them to learn what's going on in the state. How does human trafficking look in New Hampshire? Right. What contributes to vulnerability? How is it actually happening? The recruitment and control tactics, for example, and then how can we respond? How do we best come alongside?
Yeah, that sounds like a really good opportunity for us to learn and have a better understanding of human trafficking, which is a huge problem, not just in New Hampshire, but across the country. Mm-hmm. And I would actually say it's actually globally that we're seeing problems, issues with regards to human trafficking. So can we let our viewers have a better understanding of what exactly is human trafficking? What does that mean?
That's such a good question, Bobby, because there are so many misconceptions that are out there. Things we see in the media, whether that's movies or the news, for example. And so the very basic simplified definition, and this is taken from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was the law that was first enacted, it's federal law, back in the year 2000, which made human trafficking a crime. Mm-hmm. So the simplified version of that is that human trafficking occurs when someone is compelled to provide labor or a service or to perform a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. And I think one of the main things to realize when we're looking at that, one of the misconceptions is that it's happening over there, it's international, or if it's happening here in the U.S., that it involves foreign nationals, or maybe it's only happening in the bigger cities, which of course it is, and that's very important. Right. But it's actually happening right here in our own backyard. I've been a member of the New Hampshire Human Trafficking Task Force as well for many years, and we have seen cases of both sex and labor trafficking in all 10 counties. So it's not just in Manchester, Nashua, or maybe the Seacoast. It's also up in Coos County. We've seen like I said, urban centers, rural areas even. Sometimes it's easier to stay under the radar. But it's absolutely happening right here in our own backyard. And I think the other thing that oftentimes people don't realize is that a lot of attention is given to abductions or kidnapping scenarios. Right. That makes the media many times, understandably so. Mm-hmm. And that can happen, but it's actually only about 8 to 10% of cases that involve abduction. Far more often, it's someone that someone knows, and it's a grooming process. Right. That could be a family member potentially, but it also could be somebody, perhaps a romantic partner, or other individuals that are really preying on vulnerable people. Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned, Donna, what we see in the media, because that has started to rise. Today is Friday. Just the other day, they showed with the preparation of back to school, they were doing some promotion and awareness around abduction of children because they had an incident that occurred, and I don't remember which state it was in, where a couple of youth were playing outside and a van drove up and tried to coerce the young youth onto the van. And so that was on Good Morning America, where they're talking right now of, parents be aware, teach your children to be aware. But as you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be just the abduction, but it could be the subtle and insidious way that people are in vulnerable positions and then taken advantage of. So for instance, we have had an increase in our homeless status or situation in in New Hampshire, and in particular here in Nashua. We've seen an increase in substance misuse as well. And then we're also learning about increases with mental health issues. And so all of those things can play a role or factor in human trafficking or in a person being taken advantage of. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, what are some things that we should look for in individuals or even for protection for ourselves within that regard?
You're right, Bobby. There's so much overlap between all of these issues that contribute to someone being vulnerable to potential exploitation. Whether they're struggling with substance use disorder. For example, there are traffickers. It's a very common way to keep somebody compliant. It's a very strong deterrent for leaving or exiting. When someone has become your supplier, sometimes for free at first, but what the goal being to create that dependence. And if it doesn't already exist, and it may, but to use that to their advantage. There have been trafficking situations where individuals were expected to meet a certain quota on a given day, and that money all went to their trafficker.
Right.
And then or in one case that's very well known in Manchester, half the money went to the trafficker, and the other half they had to use to purchase drugs from him. They were also forced to sell drugs, so a form of labor trafficking was happening as well as trafficking for sex. Mental health challenges, as you said, individuals that are struggling with being unhoused, past trauma and abuse. So many times there's these different contributing factors that have led to one of the circumstances.
Right.
Whether that's a situation where that trauma led to perhaps using substances as a means to cope or to numb out. Which might have led to a situation where now that individual is struggling with homelessness.
Yes.
And you can imagine what that's like when you're in a situation where you're on the street and struggling every day to think, where am I going to be tonight?
Right.
How am I going to be able to get something to eat? Am I going to be safe? And then, of course, there's always the weather considerations. And we've had, I've worked with women over the years who a lot of their day is spent trying to find someplace where they would feel safe for that night. But then it's also a negotiation as far as what the expectations might look like.
Right.
And
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, so there's that intersectionality. And then also for, you talked about labor, and so there are cases, and I remember a case that happened a number of years ago in Litchfield where there were some individuals that were working on a farm. Their passports and paperwork were taken and stolen. And so they were forced to stay here and forced to work. And so it may, some of the exploitation or the trafficking may not just be for sexual, but it may be for that labor.
Absolutely. That case was actually back in 2003. It was successfully prosecuted. It was the second federally prosecuted case in the United States after the Trafficking Victims Protection Act first came into being.
New Hampshire.
Who would have thought? In Litchfield.
In little
That's
old
right.
Litchfield. I used to live in Litchfield.
Yeah, for a tree service and landscaping company.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right.
Where individuals were promised a certain type of work and a certain rate of pay, and then when they got here, they were not paid that. The work was potentially dangerous. They were denied medical attention when needed in a couple of situations, and then also they were promised accommodations, but they were living in a shed and a trailer in the back without adequate plumbing or heating.
Water, right,
A
yes.
lot of things going on with that case, for sure.
So since that case was actually prosecuted, how did public safety, police, how did they become aware of it? Because there is also that threat and that fear, right? And sometimes that's what keeps people from coming forth or talking about their circumstance or their situation. Or sometimes they may not even understand that they're in a situation where their liberties or their freedoms are taken away from them. So how did that actually come out to play to where there was a notification made in that case?
Sometimes it can be a situation where someone's observed it. Neighbors or individuals that it can be hard because many times, especially with labor trafficking, it can be within a legitimate enterprise, legitimate business. We see a lot of labor trafficking in this state that involves domestic service, though. And you can imagine there's isolation there where that individual doesn't have an opportunity to really connect in any meaningful way to a community member that might be able to help in some way. And you're right, there's a lot of, as far as law enforcement, One of the key things has been training over the many years. They've done an amazing job of both, we have task force officers as well as Homeland Security individuals on the task force who have led the training for law enforcement. It's now a unit in the State Police Academy that every new recruit will go through and have that training as well. But unfortunately, one of the things that happens many times, and again, this is a way to keep somebody compliant, is it's really drilled into them that you can't trust anybody, especially law enforcement
Right.
or even service providers, anyone in a position to help. And sometimes there may be experience that kind of backs that up in their opinion, things that have happened to them in their past, but many times that is just over and over again. And they're manipulated to also feel that they've made a choice. So often that's part of that grooming process where that, an individual is targeted. There's some vulnerabilities here that trafficker perceives they might be able to use to their advantage. And then they work on grooming, creating that relationship, building some trust. Getting to know them, learning information they might be able to use against them for that matter, to keep them trapped in some way. What are their goals and dreams? What are their hopes? And then what are their vulnerabilities? Anything that might be useful to them. Then it moves into an isolation stage where, if you can separate them from anyone in their life, if they do have family or peer support that might recognize, well, wait a minute, what's happening here? There's something's going on. That's going to be, of course, very helpful. But the idea behind isolation really is to create emotional and economic dependence. That trafficker becomes the key person for them. And then it moves into that control phase where we see force, fraud, coercion, many times a combination of all three. Sometimes it's very specific arbitrary rules that are really designed to reinforce the power dynamic. Who's really in control here? And it just makes the thought of exiting, and like you say, force, all those threats of violence, actual violence that they've either experienced or seen perpetrated, lack of, what do I go to? So many times people will say, well, why don't they just leave if they're not necessarily, Donna, if you're telling me that they're not chained to a radiator, which we see all those types of, imagery sometimes, or if they're not necessarily confined in some way, if they happen to be out and about to a certain degree, why don't they leave? And honestly, I think the answer to that is, to what?
Correct.
Do they have someone they can turn to? Is there a safe person? Do they have a way to support themselves when they maybe have not been in the workforce for how long? Maybe they weren't allowed to finish their education. Do they have a safe place to live? And we all know what the housing crisis looks like right now. Do they have a record, which then affects potential, and may have that record because of things they were forced to do by their trafficker, mind you. But that affects being able to get safe housing and to get a job many times. Do they have access to the medical and mental health care that they need? Child care, for that matter, if they have children. So there's a lot of things that would potentially keep someone from being able to feel that they have any hope in exiting.
Right, yeah. So it sounds like there's a great deal of complexity in this type of a situation that a person might find themselves in, and maybe not even a person, but even family members, right? You mentioned if there's children involved as well. So for those of us who work in settings like healthcare or, not just hospitals or doctor's offices, but even for us in public health or even in just social services, what are some things that an observer, should look for? Because it's one of those things of, see something, say something. If something looks off, these are things where we can report so that we can help a person that might be in a situation where they themselves feel powerless, they may feel hopeless, but they may not even see a way out of it. But there may be, an opportunity that maybe if they gave like a certain look or a glance, to someone, and if there's, how you have the little hairs like kind of like pop up on the back of your neck, or there's something that gives you that there's something off in this situation, what should a person do?
That's an excellent question, and it really depends on what you're seeing or observing at the time. But some of the things that you can look for, are they with someone that seems to be very controlling, like kind of interrupting a lot, not letting them speak for themselves, or if they are speaking, does it sound kind of coached or scripted? That type of idea. Are they are you seeing a lot of anxiety? Do they look fearful? Are they evasive about answering anything? Or they might even be hostile. A friend of mine who was trafficked said, I was the patient you didn't want to have. I was in your face. I did not want to be there. I wasn't going to give you any information. All of those things. Many times, some of the most difficult scenarios that we might encounter in working with a client or a patient are people who have had significant trauma. And there's a reason, of course, that we're seeing that behavior. Some of the other signs that you might see, are they malnourished? Do they look like they're exhausted? Are they struggling with substance use? Now, any of these could be a variety of things, of course. But as you start to see them add up, it just, I think, it begs a deeper level of questioning, right? Just going a little further. Sometimes, you know, I've seen some clients or I've seen some patients that have experienced this, XYZ, whatever that might be. Is that something that you are familiar with, or has that happened to you or someone you know? Sometimes that's a way to kind of bridge.
Open it up.
Yeah, some of that universal education, so to speak. Or, you know, we've seen an uptick with patients that are struggling with this, so we're making sure we get this information to everyone. Right? Because many times in your interactions, you're not always going to have a disclosure. If you have a disclosure, there's another whole, you know, thought process as far as how to handle that, making sure that if it's an adult, for example, that you have their consent for any further conversations. And if that adult has the right to decline, you know, going forward with pressing charges. Obviously, if it's a minor, then we have mandatory reporting and other things that come into play. Those types of things are really important to remember. But I think one of the things, actually, healthcare providers, I'll just say this, according to the CDC and the State Department, as of the Trafficking in Persons report that came out in 2017, the State Department puts that out every year, they declared human trafficking to be a serious public health issue. And healthcare providers, according to one particular study in particular, are the most likely to run into human trafficking victims, for labor or sex for that matter, during their exploitation. Obviously, law enforcement gets very involved at different points, service providers too, but healthcare providers, it's really key that they have that training. And in the training that we do offer, we go into a lot of the indicators, different things you might see situationally, historically, behaviorally, but also what are the physical indicators that you might notice too. You know, has someone come in with a serious industrial accident where there's no indication that there was protective gear, and there's no documentation, something like that that would stir. I remember also in a setting where I was doing some training with student nurses, one of the nurses came up afterwards and said, I think I might have seen this on my floor last night. And she described a setting where a woman had come into the ER struggling with a drug overdose. And it was serious enough that she was admitted to her floor. And there was some chatter in the ER at that time that there might have been pimp involvement. But she said, this is what I observed when she came to my floor. There was someone that came to the room who said he was her husband, but there was no contact at all. And she goes, they didn't even really talk. Not what you might expect for someone that's going through something really difficult. And she said, I got the impression that he was just there to watch her. And then the other thing that she noticed, she goes, as the night was going on, the woman was really very, very hyper concerned about her phone because it was losing its charge. And we're all attached to our phones, of course. But that's another thing that could be something, a trafficker, many times, you may not be confined, but the tether is the phone.
Yes, because if they can't reach them.
You're expected to answer that call or text right away. Now, do we know that that was trafficking from those two things? No, but does that beg, are those red flags that beg a deeper look? Absolutely. So there's a variety of things that we might be seeing. And some of them, again, as I mentioned, are applicable to a lot of different circumstances. But I think the key is to have some good screening questions to be able to ask that, again, depending on answers, that kind of goes with where you might go next in the conversation. And then making sure that you can get that information into their hands. This might be the only time that they interact with someone who is able to help them know that there are resources available. They might not be ready then, but you're planting seeds, and that's so important. And just that compassionate, empathetic response where somebody's I think for a lot of us, and certainly trafficking victims included, sometimes the assumption is in an appointment or an interaction that that person's too busy. They're distracted. They don't really necessarily care. They don't want to hear this, that kind of thing. And that could be true, but it could not be true too, of course not. But on the other hand, being able to convey that, you know, you're really listening, actively listening, and that you're empathetic, non-judgmental, communicating dignity and respect in those interactions, which everyone deserves. It can go such a long way for possibly setting up the next provider that they see.
Yeah, and I can see how that makes, that could make the individual feel like, you know, that just enough attention is being paid that they might be able to communicate something in a non-verbal way to give a signal to let someone know that something is happening here that I need some help with. And like you said, when they're ready. Because sometimes, Donna, a person may not even realize the situation that they're in, but when they do get to that point where they do and they're looking for help, it would be advantageous for us that are providers or that are in the space that could recognize this to have some training to be able to pick up on those cues or pick up on those signals, right? I think about some of the work that I used to do as a home visitor, where I had the opportunity to, you know, go into the home and, you know, work with new moms after they'd had their babies and see, you know, in a setting where there may have been an individual who was isolated because they didn't speak the language. They were new to the country. And they were there and all they were doing was the cooking and the labor and the work. And then understanding that that could be a possible situation where that type of exploitation is occurring, because that's all that person does, is they're just there for that. And so I would ask those questions. At the time, though, I didn't know what would be the next steps, And so I think the trainings are so important. I would just ask the person, do you feel safe? So there are certain questions that we would have in during that home visit setting, you know, where you would ask, you know, do you feel safe here? But if there are other people that are there, you really,
how do they respond?
How do you respond to that question? How can you talk a little bit, Donna, about like how can we get the training? So in the work that we do in public health, we work with individuals that are in vulnerable states. We see people that are experiencing homelessness. We see individuals that are dealing with substance misuse. We have a clinic. We have a sexual wellness clinic where people come in. So we need training to see, like, if a person comes in, and I actually had this experience where an older adult male brought in a younger adult female and did not want to leave the exam room. It was like, well, you can't stay in here, right? Just that fear of that person being alone, not knowing what they would say to the provider. Right? And that did bring some concern, like red flags went off all over the place for me for that. And I was asking the person a number of questions, and they said that their parent, mother, had set them up in that situation, right? And so, again, all kinds of bells are going off. It's like, okay, but what are the next steps that we take, especially when the person who is of adult age but younger says, no, I'm fine.
I think, again, Bobby, that's kind of where that universal education comes in, and just letting them know that they're, you know, being that non-judgmental, caring person, that's still going to sink in, that there is somebody that listened, that cared, and then giving them the information, whatever resources you might have. And I would make that universal in the sense that maybe there's something that, if it doesn't already exist, any particular provider could have that lists different, maybe it's domestic violence information, human trafficking information, where the shelters are in the area, where, you know, again, just some information that we're trying to get out there. I think that's really valuable. If they do want to talk to someone, if there is a disclosure, potentially bringing in an advocate from Bridges, for example, because they can work with a human trafficking victim, as well as obviously with domestic violence and sexual assault victims, or having somebody from social services that's in your potentially connected to your group. come in and talk to them further, asking those questions, asking them what they, again, making sure their consent is given freely and informed, of course.
Right.
And then if they are looking for services, in the training that we offer, we do have a whole list of contact information and support services, and I can actually send you some of that information as well.
That would be really good. And for our viewers, for those that are watching, Donna, what information do you want them to know about the training and how they could actually access training as well?
If they would like to email me, that would probably be the easiest way. That would be just Donna at NHTFC. So basically it's New Hampshire Traffic Free Coalition. So Donna at NHTFC.org. And I'm the training coordinator. I'd be happy to set that up. We do a number of different trainings depending on professional needs and capacity for, as I mentioned, service providers, healthcare providers. We've done it for law enforcement and educators, community members, and it's all tailored. The first part is usually, what is actually human trafficking? Let's make sure we're on the same page.
Right.
How is it happening? What are we seeing in New Hampshire? And then the second part is definitely tailored to who we're speaking to.
Right.
So clearly indicators are different for healthcare professionals than they would be for potentially a service provider or a community member for that matter.
Right.
But we're happy to, whatever works best and whatever time frame they might have, we can absolutely tailor it to their needs. Because I do believe that there's something that we all can do. If we're, an informed and engaged community can make such a difference. Oftentimes we're speaking to professionals, but now they're also, their eyes are opened as a community member too to something that they might observe. Because as you said, it's see something, say something for sure. And there are supports out there. There are resources available. And we can work together to make sure that we have safe, healthy communities for everyone.
And that's what we want, right? We do. We try to make sure that we promote as much awareness about these types of things that happen in our communities because it's happening in our community.
That's right.
And so how do we protect those who are the most vulnerable or that may find themselves in these vulnerable situations where they're exploited because of their mental health status, because of their inability to maintain housing or their inability to maintain their coping without using substances as a result of any one of those types of situations, right? And so I appreciate you so much for agreeing to be with me this morning to share this information to our community, because our community will thrive together to help everyone be as safe and as healthy as they can if we are, paying attention to one another and addressing the needs of those that are around us. And so, I think that whole see something, say something is really, really important, and just watching out for each other.
Right, Bobby, it's so true. It's not on our watch, not in our backyard.
Right.
And there's something that everybody personally can do on lots of different levels. And we have a whole, when we're at training for especially community members, ways to take action that are really practical. And I understand that everybody has a different skill set. Everybody has different time available for that matter. But there is something we all can do, for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna. You've been watching the Public Health Matters show, where we talk about things that matter in public health. I'm Bobby Bagley, and I'm reminding you to have a great day today and a better day tomorrow. And I'll see you the next time on Public Health Matters.